the pace of the Iran war is dominated by a pair of ticking clocks. And if you understand what happened with the first clock and what is happening with the second clock, a lot of the puzzling aspects of the war start to make sense. And then we can have a much better discussion of whether this whole enterprise was a good idea in the first place. The first of these clocks was the race to start the war. It is easy to forget, but there was once this other year called 2025, and in November of it, the Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group headed to the Caribbean to prepare for a special Maduro operation. Then, in January of this year, massive protests started in Iran, which encouraged the Trump administration to offer firepower in support. Now, this story has been told 1,000 times before, so I do not want to belabor the point. Prior to the Venezuela thing, the Ford was in the Persian Gulf region. But with it gone, and no other carriers nearby, the United States was out of position to provide effective help to the Iranian protesters. Hence the delay until February 28th and the start of the Iran war. Well, as I said, the United States felt a clock ticking in the background as it planned for the operation. For one set of the incentives, the more that time progressed, the less effective an intervention the United States could stage in Iran. Half of that was because if the protesting movement naturally subsided, it would be hard to coordinate everyone to get back on the street after the war began. The other half was because the Iranian government may well have massacred anyone left on the streets in the interim, giving the United States a smaller denominator to work with, never mind that those people were, people. From my position behind a keyboard, I cannot tell you what the optimal trade-off year was. I can say fairly confidently that the best choice was not to start shooting immediately after the protest crackdowns happened. The United States lacked sufficient firepower to have a meaningful impact at that point. In contrast, all of Iran's ballistic missiles and drones never left the region, so they would soon find their way over to U.S. bases and allied assets. To make matters worse, the United States did not have sufficient Patriots or THAADs or patrol aircraft to shoot down those ballistic missiles and drones. If you think that this war is going poorly for the United States, the same fight started in January would have been an unmitigated disaster. It is no secret why U.S. regional partners were lobbying Trump to wait. This is why. On the flip side, I can also tell you that waiting for months on end, then starting a war at that point, also would have been a terrible decision. If this war began in, say, September, then there would be little expectation that the protests would have any impact on the conflict. They would have stopped coordinating by that point, and good luck trying to restart that absent some enormous heavy lifting from U.S. boots on the ground. And you might be thinking to yourself, wait, aren't protesters having no effect on the conflict right now anyway? Well, hold that general thought for a minute, but note for now that the government is still worried about it and still has to allocate effort to suppress potential rebellion. Put differently, if you think that things are going bad right now, they would be going worse if not for that. In sum, there was some type of inexorable trade-off that the United States had to make here. And it is interesting that the prevailing social media sentiment in January was criticism of the United States for not intervening, but fast forward to the beginning of March, and the criticism is now of the United States for intervening. Perhaps part of that is due to the imperfect intervention that we are now observing, necessitated by wanting to keep some hope for the protesters. Let me walk you through some of the decisions made and their consequences now. As a starting point, the Ford should not even be there. It was supposed to enter routine maintenance earlier this year, but it was one of the two carriers available, so off it went to the region. At this point, I am sure that its crew is looking forward to sleeping in a normal bed. They might also like to have the confidence that their toilets will work, but these are relatively small trade-offs in the grand scheme of things. It has meant that minesweepers are out of position at a time when rumors swirl that Iran either already has or will soon mine the Strait of Hormuz. It has meant that THAAD systems in South Korea, which evidently the Pentagon thinks are temporarily better suited to be in the Gulf region, are just now getting shipped over. It has meant that the USS Tripoli, along with its Marine Expeditionary Force, is also just now sailing westward from the Philippine Sea, its purpose unknown. Highly enriched uranium, Karg Island to disrupt Iranian oil operations, the coastline to stop ships from laying mines, or maybe targets of opportunity that are not yet apparent but may soon present themselves. Ninja late-breaking update here. The United States indeed struck Karg Island, focusing on kinetic actions to destroy Iran's military infrastructure there. 90% of Iran's oil products go through the island, but notably the United States has tried not to touch that associated infrastructure. These efforts have not stopped oil prices from climbing once again, currently close to $100 per barrel as I wrap up this addendum to the video. Another recurring point here is the lack of a ground-fired Shahed defense system like the one that Ukraine has. Aside from the point that the US strategy is to shoot the archer, not the arrow, there is a deeper question of why Iran's enemies in the region did not invest in such a system a year ago or so. Because doing it right, not implementing the emergency mitigation measures that Ukraine is currently providing, but actually doing it right, would take months. The explanation here is a more complicated story involving the politics of the world at war, so I will save it for another time. Regardless, it was another part of the trade-off, because waiting that long would have again removed the protesters from the picture. And that is why we have the war that we currently have, not some idealized version of the conflict. I wanted to go through all of this because it much better frames the partisan debate about the war. One side will tell you that the Trump administration was completely oblivious to the military fallout that would come out of it. This is nonsense because no political side of an administration is ever tasked with understanding the military strategy. That is the Pentagon's job, and it is not even the Secretary of Defense's job, so we cannot look at Hegseth either. Maybe the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and one-time F-16 pilot Dan Kane had no idea how an air war works. Maybe Commander of CENTCOM Admiral Charles Cooper, a man who has personally sailed through the Strait of Hormuz multiple times, has no clue about the risks of shutting down the Strait of Hormuz. But both of those theories strain credulity, and they are the ones that are actually doing the planning. Or, if you want to get even more technical, they're the ones overseeing the real grunt work of the planning and ensuring that none of the big picture items are missed. On the other side of the aisle, you have a group insisting that the war is going spectacularly, and there is nothing for the American public to worry about. But that also strains credulity because of the very real trade-offs that had to go into planning the war. And more practically speaking, we are not yet seeing the endgame in front of us. So if I may humbly suggest a better debate to have about this war, it is as follows. What we are observing now is the best trade-off that the Pentagon thought it could muster between preparing the US military for the task and letting the protest movement fade into nothing. Oh, there is also a mix of the US intelligence apparatus having to weigh the trade-offs. The point is, the calculation of the trade-offs is mostly a boring bureaucratic task. However, there was no rule saying that the United States had to do anything at all, and the decision to actually go is very much a political one. So if you think that doing nothing was better than prosecuting this specific war, that is a perfectly reasonable viewpoint. If you also want to talk about other political decisions that handicap the United States here, like diverting resources to Venezuela or burning bridges with allies, that is also a perfectly reasonable viewpoint. But when you are facing a ticking clock, comparing what we have to an idealized version of the war invokes a meaningless counterfactual scenario. Well, now that I have revealed myself to be a MAGA enthusiast with Trump derangement syndrome, who has successfully induced all partisans to unsubscribe, and the politically agnostic to unsubscribe, let's transition to our second ticking clock. How long the United States can sustain operations before running against the very real limits of US stockpiles. And really, this is a question of how much time a competing clock has left on it that marks the longevity of the Iranian government, assuming that it is on a ticking clock at all. I know that the Trump administration likes to avoid discussing regime change as an explicit goal of the operation, but let's pause for a moment to understand why. There is absolutely no guarantee that regime change is in the cards here, and unlike many of the administration's other half goals, like reducing Iranian ballistic missile capabilities, measuring this is not nebulous. Either the government is in power or it is not. Thus, claiming that it is a goal is politically dangerous because it provides a clear metric for others to judge his failures. And if it ends up being a success, he hardly gets the extra points for putting it on the target list from the start. Well, the early signals for regime change do not look good here. As far as we can tell, There is no immediate replication of earlier protests, despite the United States enfeebling Iran's security forces. Why not is hard to say. It is possible that the United States has not yet taken serious aim at security forces, because anti-aircraft systems, missiles and drones, and Hormuz security are higher priorities. Maybe that will change in the upcoming weeks. Yikes, weeks. I can just feel the cringe from the Indo-Pacific faction of the Pentagon at the notion of burning through Tomahawk stockpiles for weeks more. Maybe the government's crackdowns were too damaging, eliminating the most ardent critics and leaving a frightened public behind. Maybe Israel's participation in the war has polarized what you might call the moderates in the country into supporting the regime. Either way, leaked information from U.S. intelligence does not paint a good picture. There is, quote, consistent analysis that the regime is not in danger, end quote, and that the regime, quote, retains control of the Iranian public, end quote. Meanwhile, also according to the intelligence, Kurdish groups in the northwest corner of the country do not have the mass to pose a legitimate threat to the government. That, of course, raises questions of whether Kurdish groups in the neighboring countries could provide enough. And that raises the question of how much the United States shot itself in the foot by de facto abandoning the Kurds in Syria a couple of months ago. Again, a political decision, not a military one. The only bright spot here for the United States is the apparent absence of the new supreme leader. The only evidence that we have that this is not a case of weekend at the Ayatollahs is a written speech. No video, no pictures, not even any audio. Something is clearly wrong here, otherwise he would go on television and resolve any uncertainty. Worst case scenario for the United States, he is moderately injured and does not want to have a timid first public appearance. Best case scenario for the United States, he is critically injured and unlikely to survive. That could be good just for the chaos of a second turnover in only a handful of days. A more interesting possibility is that the Assembly of Experts and IRGC knew that his injuries were life-threatening ahead of time, and named him supreme leader as a stopgap measure. If there is a succession crisis happening inside of Iran, it would be better not to publicize that to both the United States and the Iranian people. So, put in a placeholder and hope to sort it all out while the Grim Reaper approaches. The reason that this would be good news for the United States is because it leaves open the possibility that the government may still fall apart from the inside. It is just a question of whether the internal political jockeying evolves into something truly destabilizing. But until there is some real indication that something like that is happening, the clock continues to tick on U.S. stockpiles. Speaking of stockpiles, I am loaded up on videos about the broader conflict in the Middle East. Check out this playlist to view a few of them. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe. And I will see you next time. Take care.